On a Thursday morning in March of 1987, Delmar Huber walked into the back room of his shop in Platte County, Nebraska, and looked at what 12 years of other people's problems had become. The room was 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, and it was full. Not cluttered, not disorganized. Full in the way that a library is full, everything placed with intention, everything cataloged in the ledger he kept on the shelf above the door, everything waiting for the moment it would be needed again. There were gears stacked on wooden pallets, shafts laid across sawhorses, housings lined up against the south wall with their part numbers written in black marker on strips of masking tape. There were bearings and coffee cans sorted by diameter. There were seals in labeled cardboard boxes, gaskets pressed flat between sheets of wax paper, and in the far corner, wrapped in burlap and tied with baling twine, 3 complete transmission assemblies that nobody in the county had thought were worth keeping. Delmar had thought differently. Delmar had been thinking differently for 12 years, quietly and without announcement, while a man named Wade Crowley ran the only John Deere dealership in Platte County and told every farmer who walked through his door that the old parts were gone, the old machines were obsolete, and the future was sitting on his showroom floor with a price tag attached. Let me tell you about Delmar Huber, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. And what he did took 12 years to become visible, which is longer than most people are willing to wait for anything. Delmar was 61 years old in March of 1987. He had been born in the same farmhouse where his father had been born, on 320 acres of bottom ground along the Loup River that his grandfather had broken with a walking plow in 1901. The farm had survived the drought years of the 1930s because his grandfather had refused to plant the same thing twice in the same field, rotating corn and oats and hay in a pattern that kept the soil from exhausting itself. It had survived the farm crisis of the 1980s because Delmar had no debt to speak of. Having paid off the last of his operating loans in 1979 and decided, after watching 3 neighbors lose their places to the bank in the same calendar year, that he would rather farm less ground and own it outright than farm more ground and belong to someone else. He was not a complicated man. He was not a man who gave speeches or attended meetings or wrote letters to the county paper. He was a man who watched things, remembered what he saw, and drew conclusions slowly and without drama. He had opened the shop in 1975, not as a business exactly, but as a place to do his own mechanical work and, eventually, the mechanical work of anyone in the county who needed it done right and couldn't afford to be told the part was discontinued. He had 2 lathes, a drill press, a welding table, and a parts washer he had built himself from a 55-gallon drum and a sump pump motor. He charged what the work cost him in time and materials, and not much more, which meant he was never going to get rich from the shop, but which also meant that farmers trusted him in a way they did not always trust the dealership, where the labor rate had climbed to $42 an hour by 1986 and the service writer sometimes couldn't tell you when your machine would be ready. The parts room had begun by accident. A neighbor named Sorensen had pulled a complete rear axle assembly off a 1958 Model 520. He was scrapping in 1975. The same week, Delmar opened the shop and had asked if Delmar wanted it for anything. Delmar had said yes without knowing exactly why. He put it on a shelf. 6 months later, a farmer named Peterson came in looking for exactly that axle for a 520 he was trying to keep running, and Delmar sold it to him for what Sorensen had asked, which was nothing, plus $10 for his trouble. That was the beginning. After that, word moved through the county the way word moves in small places, quietly from one conversation to the next, without advertisement or announcement. And farmers began showing up with parts they were pulling off machines they were retiring, and Delmar began writing everything down in the ledger. Let me tell you about Wade Crowley, because the story doesn't work without him, and because Wade Crowley was not, by any honest accounting, a bad man. He was a successful man, which in 1975 in Platte County, Nebraska, looked almost the same as a good man, but was not quite identical. Wade had taken over the dealership from his father in 1971 at the age of 34, and in the 16 years since, he had built it into the largest John Deere operation in 3 counties. He had expanded the service department, added a parts counter with a full-time parts manager, and invested in the diagnostic equipment that the factory was beginning to require for the newer machines. He drove a clean pickup and wore pressed shirts and knew the name of every farmer in the county, and their wives and most of their children. He was, in the way of successful rural businessmen, genuinely liked by many people and genuinely respected by most. He was also absolutely certain, with the certainty of a man whose business model depended on it, that old machines were a liability and new machines were the answer, and that anyone who disagreed with him on this point was either sentimental or foolish or both. He had made this position known about Delmar Huber's shop in the particular way that men in his position make positions known. Not with direct confrontation, but with small comments delivered at the co-op counter, or the elevator, or the implement auction that accumulated over time into a clear picture. He had said, on more than one occasion, that a man keeping a room full of old parts was like a man keeping a room full of old prescriptions. Technically, they might still work, but you wouldn't want to bet your operation on it. He had said that Delmar was a fine welder and a decent machinist, but that farming had gotten too complicated for shade tree mechanics, and that the farmers who understood this were the ones who would still be in business in 10 years. He had said these things pleasantly and without malice, in the tone of a man sharing practical wisdom, and most of the people who heard them nodded, because Wade Crowley had been right about a lot of things over a lot of years, and there was no obvious reason to think he was wrong about this. Delmar heard these comments. In a county of that size, a man hears everything eventually. He did not respond to them. He went back to his shop and wrote another entry in his ledger and stacked another gear on another pallet and waited. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man wait? Not impatiently, not with his eye on the clock, but with the particular quality of patience that belongs to people who work with machinery. The patience of a man who understands that a process has its own timeline, and that pushing against it accomplishes nothing except damage. That is how Delmar waited. He waited the way a good mechanic waits for a seized bolt to soak, knowing that the penetrating oil needs time to work its way into the threads, knowing that the man who loses patience and reaches for the impact wrench is the man who snaps the bolt off flush and turns a 2-hour job into a 2-day job. He waited with purpose and without hurry, and the parts room filled up around him, and the ledger grew thicker, and the years went by. Let me tell you about the parts room in 1987, because by then it had become something that required description. Delmar kept the ledger in a 3-ring binder with index tabs organized by manufacturer and model series. By March of 1987, the binder had 847 entries. He had parts for John Deere machines going back to the Model A and the Model B, for Oliver machines going back to the '88 series, for Alice Chalmers machines going back to the WD-45, for International Harvester machines going back to the M and the H, for Farmall machines of every vintage, and for a scattering of Minneapolis Moline and Case and Cockshut parts that had come to him over the years from farmers who had run those brands and couldn't find anyone else who wanted what was left. He had a 1963 John Deere 401 power shift transmission, complete, that a farmer named Erickson had pulled out of a machine he was parting out in 1981 and had offered to Delmar for $30 because the alternative was taking it to the scrap yard. He had a set of rear axle shafts for a 1967 John Deere 4020 that had come to him in 1983 from a widow named Burkhart, whose husband had died and whose sons had no interest in farming, and who had asked Delmar to take what he wanted from the machine shed before the auction. He had, in the far corner under the burlap, 3 complete final drive assemblies for a 1955 John Deere 70 diesel that a farmer named Tesdall had pulled off 3 machines he was scrapping in 1979 and had brought to Delmar in a single load because he said he had a feeling Delmar would know what to do with them. Delmar had written all of this down. Every part, every donor machine, every date of acquisition, every condition note. He had written it in the careful block printing of a man who had learned early that illegible records are the same as no records, and he'd kept the binder on the shelf above the door where he could reach it without moving anything else. Wade Crowley had seen the parts room once, in 1982, when he'd come by the shop to ask Delmar about a piece of property that adjoined both their operations. He had stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and the pallets and the coffee cans and the ledger binder, and he had said, with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement, that Delmar had himself quite a collection of antiques. Delmar had said he preferred to think of them as inventory. Wade had smiled at that, the smile of a man who finds a harmless eccentricity charming, and had not thought much more about it. That was 1982. 5 years later, everything changed. Let me tell you about the spring of 1987 because that spring was the moment when 12 years of quiet accumulation became something that the county could not ignore. It began with the machines. The John Deere 4240 series had been a popular tractor in Platte County through the late 1970s and early 1980s. Not the newest thing by 1987, but not old either, and a machine that many farmers had bought on the strength of Wade Crowley's recommendation and his financing arrangements and the general understanding that John Deere built equipment that lasted. The 4240 was a good tractor. It was also a tractor with a known weakness in its power shift transmission, specifically in the clutch pack assembly and the range clutch discs, which under heavy use in sandy soil conditions, and the bottom ground along the Loop River was sandy in places, tended to wear faster than the factory had anticipated. By 1987, a significant number of the 4240s that had been sold in Platte County in 1978 and 1979 were coming due for transmission work, and the work was not cheap. Wade Crowley's parts manager had quoted a complete clutch pack rebuild on a 4240 transmission at $2,400 in parts alone, plus labor at $42 an hour for what the service department estimated was a 22-hour job. The total, with tax, came to something north of $3,300, which in the spring of 1987, in the middle of the farm crisis, was a number that made grown men sit down. Some farmers paid it because they had no choice. Some farmers decided to run their machines until the transmissions failed completely and deal with the consequences then. And some farmers, 3 of them in the first 4 months of 1987, drove past the dealership and turned left instead of right, and went to Delmar Huber's shop on the county road. The first was a man named Lyle Ostrander, who farmed 480 acres of corn ground north of Columbus, and who had bought his 4,240 new in 1979, and who had been told by the dealership that his transmission was going to need a full rebuild before spring planting. Lyle was 53 years old and had been farming since he was 16, and had a particular reluctance to spend money he didn't have on problems he didn't fully understand. He came to Delmar on a Tuesday in February and explained the situation and asked what Delmar thought. Delmar asked him to describe the symptoms. Lyle described them: the slipping under load in the higher range gears, the hesitation on engagement, the occasional shudder when shifting at full throttle. Delmar listened without interrupting and then said he would need to look at the machine before he could say anything useful. Lyle brought the tractor in on Thursday. Delmar drove it in the field behind the shop for 20 minutes and then put it on his lift and spent 2 hours doing a preliminary inspection. He came out from under the machine and told Lyle that the clutch pack was worn, as the dealership had said, but that the range clutch discs were serviceable if they were adjusted, and the hydraulic pressure to the transmission was corrected, because the pressure was low, probably a worn pump, and low pressure was accelerating the wear on everything downstream. He said the pump was the first thing to fix, because rebuilding the clutch pack with a weak pump was like putting new brake pads on a car with warped rotors. He would be doing it again in 2 years. Then he went to the ledger. He found what he needed on page 214, 14240 hydraulic pump assembly, pulled from a machine that a farmer named Novak had parted out in 1984. Condition noted as serviceable with minor wear on the drive gear. He found it on the shelf where the ledger said it would be, wiped it down, measured the gear wear with a micrometer, and told Lyle that the pump would work. He rebuilt the clutch pack using a combination of new seals, which he ordered from a specialty supplier in Omaha at significantly less than dealer cost, and the clutch discs from the Novak machine, which had less than 400 hours on them and were well within specification. He adjusted the range clutch, corrected the hydraulic pressure, and had the machine ready in 4 days. He charged Lyle $680, which included parts, machine time, and labor. Lyle Ostrander drove home, planted his corn, and told every farmer he knew. The second was a man named Harlan Dykstra, who had a 4240 with a cracked final drive housing that the dealership had quoted at $1,800 for replacement housing alone, not including the labor to install it. Delmar went to the ledger. He had a 4240 final drive housing, pulled from a machine that had been in a rollover accident in 1983. The housing was undamaged, the machine was not, and the farmer's widow had asked Delmar to take anything useful before the wreck was hauled away. The housing was on the south wall. Delmar cleaned it, pressure tested it, found it sound, and installed it on Harlan's machine for $340 total. The third was a man named Carlton Lindgren, whose 4240 had a failed power shift solenoid and a damaged valve body in the transmission control circuit, which the dealership said required a complete valve body replacement at $1,100 plus labor. Delmar had 2 valve bodies in the parts room, both pulled from machines that had been parted out, both in working condition. He tested both, installed the better one, rebuilt the solenoid with a kit he ordered from a hydraulic supply house in Lincoln, and charged Carlton $290. By May of 1987, word had moved through the county in the way that significant word always moves. faster than anyone expected, and further than anyone intended. Farmers were talking about Delmar Huber's parts room the way people talk about something they have discovered and want to protect and also cannot help but share. They were saying that he had parts for machines the dealership said were obsolete. They were saying that his prices were a fraction of what the dealership charged. They were saying that he knew things about these machines that the dealership's service department, with its factory training and its diagnostic computers, did not seem to know, or at least did not seem to apply. Wade Crowley heard all of this. He heard it at the co-op and at the elevator and at the implement auction in April, and what he heard did not please him. His service department had lost 3 jobs to Delmar Huber's shop in the first quarter of the year, and the jobs he had lost were exactly the kind: transmission rebuilds, final drive work, hydraulic system repairs, that generated the most revenue. He drove past Delmar's shop on a Thursday in May and counted 4 tractors in the yard waiting for service. One of them he recognized as belonging to a farmer who had bought it from his dealership 2 years earlier. He did not stop. He drove back to the dealership and called his parts manager into the office and asked him to pull the records on every 424. Oh, that had been sold in the county in the past 10 years, and flag the ones that were likely to need transmission work in the next 2 years. It was a reasonable business response. It was also, in the way of reasonable business responses that arrive slightly too late, not quite sufficient. Let me tell you about what happened in June of 1987. Because that month was when the situation moved from a matter of local interest to something that required a public accounting. The County Farm Bureau held its annual meeting at the Platte County Fairgrounds on the second Thursday of June, which was the kind of event that drew 300 farmers and their families, and which served as the primary social occasion of the early summer, the moment when the planting was done and the crop was in the ground, and there was a brief window before the cultivation work began when people could sit in folding chairs and eat potato salad and talk about what was happening in the county. Wade Crowley attended every year. He had a booth near the entrance where his parts manager handed out catalogs and his sales staff talked to farmers about the new equipment. He was a sponsor of the event, and his name was on the banner above the main pavilion. Delmar Huber attended most years. He sat with his neighbors and ate his potato salad and did not have a booth or a banner. He was not a man who needed a banner. The conversation happened near the implement display, where several farmers had gathered around a 424, that someone had brought for the static display, a machine that was, by the standards of 1987, beginning to show its age. Wade Crowley was standing nearby, talking to a group of farmers about the new 55 series that the factory was pushing that year, explaining the improvements in the power shift system and the hydraulic capacity and the operator comfort, making the case that the cost of upgrading was less than the cost of keeping an older machine running. He was making this case well, because he had made it many times and believed it genuinely, and several of the farmers were nodding. Delmar was standing at the edge of the group, listening. He had been listening for about 5 minutes when one of the farmers, a younger man named Briggs who had inherited his father's place and was trying to decide whether to rebuild his 4240 or trade it, asked Wade directly what he thought a man should do with a 424. Oh, that needed transmission work. Wade said, without hesitation, that the honest answer was that the cost of a proper rebuild on those transmissions was getting close to the point where it didn't make economic sense, and that a man would be better served putting that money toward a newer machine that came with a warranty and factory support and parts availability. He said that the days of keeping those old 40 series tractors going indefinitely were probably behind the county, and that farmers who were still trying to do it were spending money on a problem that wasn't going to get smaller. He said all of this looking at the group generally, but the angle of his body was pointed with the precision of a man who has practiced indirection toward Delmar Huber. Delmar waited until Wade had finished. Then he said quietly and without raising his voice that he had rebuilt 3, 4, 2, 4 transmissions in the past 4 months for a combined total of just over $1,300, and that all 3 machines were in the field and working, and that the same parts room that had supplied those rebuilds had enough inventory to handle probably 40 more jobs of the same kind before he would need to source anything new. He said he had a ledger with 847 entries, and that every entry represented a part that someone had decided was worthless and that he had decided was worth keeping, and that the difference between those 2 judgments was the difference between a $3,300 repair bill and a $680 repair bill. The group was quiet for a moment. Wade Crowley's expression did not change exactly, but something around his eyes shifted. A small adjustment, the kind a man makes when he's heard something that requires him to recalculate. He said that he was sure Delmar did good work, but that there was a difference between used parts and new parts, and that a farmer betting his operation on a used hydraulic pump pulled off a machine that had been parted out was taking a risk that a new pump from the factory eliminated. He said this with the confidence of a man who believes what he is saying, which Wade did genuinely. Delmar said that a used pump that had been inspected and measured and tested was not a risk. He said that a new pump installed in a system with low hydraulic pressure was a new pump that would wear out in 2 years, and that the dealership service records on the machines it had rebuilt would show exactly that pattern if anyone cared to look. He said this without heat, in the tone of a man stating a fact he has verified and does not feel the need to argue about. Wade Crowley said that he supposed every man had to make his own judgments about risk. It was not a concession. It was not quite a dismissal either. It was the statement of a man who has realized that the argument is not going the way he expected and who has chosen to end it without losing more ground. The farmers around them had gone very quiet. Briggs, the young man who had asked the question, looked from Wade to Delmar and then back to Wade, and then he said he thought he would stop by Delmar's shop that week and take a look at what was available for his machine. Wade nodded at this as though it were a reasonable thing to do and walked back toward his booth, and the group dispersed, and Delmar finished his potato salad and went home. Let me tell you about the next 2 years, because they were the years when the ledger proved itself in ways that even Delmar had not fully anticipated. The summer of 1987 brought 17 farmers to Delmar's shop for parts and service on machines the dealership had said were past their economic repair point. Delmar fixed all 17. The average cost of his repairs was $490. The average cost of the equivalent work at the dealership, based on the quotes that several of the farmers had received before coming to him, was $2,850. The difference across 17 jobs was $40,460, which was not Delmar's profit, but was the money that stayed in those farmers' pockets instead of going to the service department on the county road. In the farm crisis of 1987, that was not an abstraction. That was the difference for some of those families between making their operating loan payment and not making it. By the fall of 1987, Delmar had added 11 new entries to the ledger because farmers who were bringing machines in for service were also bringing parts they were pulling off machines they were retiring, and the parts room was growing. He had to build a new shelf along the east wall in October to accommodate what had come in since spring. He built it himself from 2x4s and plywood and stained it with the same oil he used on the workbench, and he labeled every new section with strips of masking tape and black marker before he put anything on it. In 1988, the pattern continued. 31 jobs, an average cost of $520, a combined savings to the county's farmers of something over $70,000 against dealership quotes. The parts room now had 1,043 entries in the ledger. Delmar had to start a second binder. Wade Crowley's dealership was not failing. It was still the largest John Deere operation in 3 counties, and it was still selling new equipment and still servicing the machines it sold and still making money. But the service department's revenue on older machine repairs had declined noticeably, and Wade knew where it was going, and the knowledge sat with him in the way that uncomfortable knowledge sits. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, in the background of everything else. He had stopped making comments about Delmar's shop at the co-op. He had not stopped thinking about it. Let me tell you about the winter of 1988, because that winter was when the situation acquired a dimension that neither man had anticipated. Wade Crowley had a heart attack in December of 1988. He was 51 years old and had been working 60-hour weeks for 17 years, and had, in the way of men who are very good at their work, neglected the maintenance of the machine that was doing the work. He survived the heart attack. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital in Columbus and came home in January of 1989 to a dealership that his parts manager and his service manager were running in his absence. Running it competently, but without the particular authority that Wade's presence had always provided. He came back to work in March of 1989, lighter by 20 pounds, and quieter by some measure that was harder to quantify. His doctor had told him to reduce his hours and his stress, and Wade was trying to do both, which meant that some of the things he had been managing personally were now being managed by other people, and some of the things that had been running on his personal attention were running less smoothly without it. The dealership's parts department had a problem that spring that Wade had not been aware of before his heart attack, and that his parts manager had not brought to him because it had seemed manageable. The problem was this. The factory had discontinued several part numbers for the 40 series and early 50 series John Deere tractors, effective January of 1989, which meant that the dealership could no longer order certain components directly from the factory, and would need to source them from aftermarket suppliers, some of whom had adequate inventory, and some of whom did not. The specific parts that had been discontinued included 2 items that were in high demand in Platte County: the clutch pack assembly for the 4240 power shift transmission and the range clutch hub for the same machine. These were the 2 components that Delmar Huber had been rebuilding for 2 years using parts from his room. Wade's parts manager discovered the discontinuation in April when he tried to order a clutch pack assembly for a customer and got a back order notice that turned into a discontinued notice 3 days later. He told Wade. Wade sat with the information for 2 days before he did anything with it. What he did was drive to Delmar Huber's shop on a Tuesday morning in April of 1989. Delmar was at the drill press when Wade came in, drilling a pattern of holes in a plate he was making for a cultivator repair. He finished the hole he was drilling before he looked up, because stopping a drill press in the middle of a hole produces a result that requires starting over, and Delmar was not a man who started things over if he could avoid it. He shut the press off and set the plate on the bench and looked at Wade Crowley standing in the doorway of his shop. Wade looked different than he had at the Farm Bureau meeting. He was thinner, and the confidence that had always been the first thing you noticed about him had been replaced by something more careful. He was wearing a canvas jacket instead of the pressed shirt, and his boots had dried mud on them, which was not usual for Wade. He looked like a man who had been reminded recently that he was mortal and had not yet decided what to do with the information. He said he supposed Delmar had heard about the discontinuations. Delmar said he had. He said it matter-of-factly, without satisfaction, because he had known the discontinuations were coming. The factory's part support timelines were predictable if you watched them, and Delmar had been watching them since 1975. Wade said he had 3 customers waiting on clutch pack assemblies and 2 more waiting on range clutch hubs, and that the aftermarket suppliers he had contacted either didn't have inventory or were quoting lead times of 16 to 20 weeks, which was not a timeline that worked for farmers in the spring. He said he was wondering if Delmar had anything that might help. Delmar went to the ledger. He had, in the second binder, 4 clutch pack assemblies for 4 240 transmissions and 7 range clutch hubs, all pulled from machines that had been parted out over the previous 14 years, all inspected and measured and noted in his careful block printing. He told Wade what he had. Wade asked what he would want for them. Delmar told him the price. It was fair, not generous, not punishing, but fair in the way that a man who has been keeping parts for 14 years because he believed they would be needed is entitled to fair when the need arrives. Wade said that was acceptable. He did not say it easily, but he said it without argument, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Delmar pulled the parts from the shelves, the clutch packs in their labeled boxes, the range clutch hubs wrapped in brown paper with their condition notes written on the outside, and laid them on the workbench. Wade looked at them. He looked at the condition notes, at the inspection dates, at the measurements Delmar had recorded. He picked up one of the clutch pack assemblies and turned it in his hands, examining the discs, the separator plates, the sealing rings. He said, quietly, that Delmar had done something here that he hadn't understood when he'd seen it in 1982. Delmar said that he supposed it had looked like a room full of junk. Wade said that was about right. He set the clutch pack down and looked at the shelves along the south wall and the pallets along the north wall and the coffee cans of bearings and the boxes of gaskets and the second binder on the shelf above the door. He said that he had told a lot of farmers over the years that the old parts were gone and the old machines were obsolete, and that he had believed it when he said it. Delmar said he knew. He said he had never thought Wade was lying. He thought Wade had been looking at the wrong thing. Wade asked him what the right thing was. Delmar thought about this for a moment, the way he thought about most things, without hurry, without performance. Then he said that the right thing was the machine in the field. Not the machine on the showroom floor, not the machine in the factory catalog, but the machine that was already in a farmer's field and already paid for and already known to that farmer in the particular way that a man knows a machine he has operated for 10 years in all conditions. He said that a machine a farmer understood was worth more than a machine a farmer didn't understand yet, and that keeping the first machine running was almost always cheaper than learning the second one, and that the parts to keep the first machine running existed somewhere if a man had been paying attention to where they went when the machines were retired. He said that was all the parts room was, paying attention to where things went. Wade Crowley stood in Delmar's shop for another 20 minutes, looking at the shelves. He bought the 4 clutch packs and the 7 range clutch hubs. He shook Delmar's hand when he left, which was not unusual between them, but the quality of the handshake was different than it had been before. More deliberate, the handshake of a man who is acknowledging something he cannot quite say in words. He came back in June with 2 of his service technicians and asked Delmar if he would be willing to show them how he was diagnosing the hydraulic pressure issue on the 4240 transmissions, because the factory's diagnostic procedure didn't flag the pump wear until it was severe enough to have already damaged the clutch packs, and Wade had realized, going back through his service records, that Delmar had been right about the pattern. Delmar spent 2 hours with the technicians at the drill press and the workbench, showing them the measurements and the pressure specifications and the wear patterns he had learned to look for. He did not charge Wade for the 2 hours. He said it was worth more to him to have the information in the county than to have the fee. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in 1989. And what happened after is the part that matters most. Wade Crowley's dealership changed in ways that were gradual and not announced. The service department began flagging hydraulic pressure on older machine rebuilds the way Delmar had shown them. The parts manager began keeping a list of discontinued part numbers and cross-referencing them against Delmar's ledger, which Delmar allowed him to copy. Not the originals, but a photocopy that was updated twice a year. The dealership began referring customers to Delmar for parts that it couldn't source, and Delmar began referring customers to the dealership for warranty work and new equipment diagnostics that required factory tools he didn't have. It was not a formal arrangement. It was the arrangement that 2 men make when they have stopped competing and started understanding what the other one knows. Wade retired in 1994, 5 years after the heart attack, at the age of 57. His son took over the dealership. At the retirement party at the Fairgrounds Pavilion, the same pavilion where his name had been on the banner for 20 years, he said in his remarks that the best business education he had received in 30 years of running a dealership had come from a man who had never taken a business class and whose office was a shop on a county road. He said Delmar Huber had understood something about parts and about farming and about what lasts that he himself had been too busy being successful to see. He said it without embarrassment, which was the most honest thing he had ever said in public, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when someone says something true. Delmar was in the room. He was sitting with his neighbors, as he always sat, and he nodded at Wade's remarks and then went back to his coffee. Let me tell you about what Delmar did with the rest of his life, because a man who builds something like that parts room doesn't stop when the vindication arrives. The vindication was never the point. He farmed the 320 acres along the Loop River until he was 74, when his knees made the climbing in and out of equipment impractical, and then he leased the ground to a neighbor's son and kept the shop. The parts room continued to grow. By 1995, the ledger had expanded to 4 binders. By 2001, it was 6. He had added a second room to the shop in 1997, a 20 by 20 addition he built with his son Gerald and his son-in-law over a long weekend in September, and he had filled half of it by the following spring. He was, by the early 2000s, known in a radius of roughly 150 miles as the man who had the part that didn't exist anymore, and farmers drove from 3 states to stand in his shop and watch him go to the ledger and come back with something wrapped in brown paper that had been waiting on a shelf for 15 or 20 years for exactly